Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks again, Sam, for inviting me. So today's presentation is going to be about the Irish bog, and I'm going to study it from an eco-Gothic and eco-feminist perspective. To do so, I will investigate 6 recent Irish films that feature wetlands, forest holes, or tunnels, which can be seen as modern avatars or renditions of deserted and eerie boglands, as they were depicted in colonial and/or Gaelic narratives. So I'm going to start with a small presentation of the 6 films I'm going to investigate today. I'm going to do this chronologically, but it doesn't mean that I'm going to spend, actually, I'm going to spend more time on some films rather than others, depending on the topic I'm going to cover. So the first one is Wickwood. It follows a couple, Patrick, he's a vet, Louise, she is a pharmacist, and their daughter Alice unfortunately gets bitten and attacked by a dog while unsupervised, and she eventually dies. So the couple moves to the village of Wickwood in Ireland and learn that there's a possibility for them to bring their daughter back for 3 days only if they perform a ritual involving burying the corpse of another deceased. But of course, the things do not go according to plan. And the Alice that comes back does not look and act the same way as the Alice they lost, to the point when she starts attacking the cattle and inhabitants nearby. The second film is entitled The Hallow by Corinne Hardy. So it follows Adam, a British microbiologist who moves to a remote farm in the Irish countryside with his wife and son, baby, actually. The plot borrows from mutation films and the myth of the changeling, when Adam is transformed into a hybrid by a variety of cordyceps he discovers in the nearby forest. And he also suspects that his child has been replaced by a hybrid himself. So we have 2 kind of changeling stories here. In Beyond the Woods, a couple invites some friends to their country house, which is lost in the middle of the forest, and upon arrival, the guests are struck by the smell of sulfur, probably caused by fumes emitted by a sinkhole, the result of mining activities, which they believe are toxic. The film follows the conventions of the slasher, when it features a demonic creature that you can see on the poster, who hunts down the characters one by one. And this film kind of stands apart from the rest of the corpus because it never actually shows the sinkhole for lack of budget. It rather focuses on the characters' interactions and until their execution, which is often rendered in gory details. Then we have The Hole in the Ground, Lee Cronin's first feature film. The plot centers around Sarah and her son Christopher, who are moving to the Irish countryside. And Christopher his behavior quickly changes after he has come into contact with a mysterious hole in the earth in the forest next to the house. Sarah is quickly convinced that a changeling has replaced her son and decides to explore the mysterious tunnel to save the real Christopher. In You Are Not My Mother, a film that was recently released and directed by a woman, we have Shar, a young teenage girl living in the suburbs of Dublin with her uncle, grandmother, and mother. And her mother, Angela, seems to be suffering from bipolar disorder. One night, she goes missing. Her car is found empty in a nearby street. When she returns, she looks and acts differently. At first, very friendly and affectionate towards her daughter, but then she quickly exhibits kind of primal and threatening symptoms. Charles' grandmother eventually confesses that the mother is a changeling and she needs to be burnt alive in order to change back into her old self. Finally, my last film is The Watchers. So it's not, the director, Ishana Shyamalan, of course, is not Irish. She's the daughter of this famous American filmmaker you might have recognized. But the whole cast and crew is Irish. It was shot on location in Ireland, and it is the adaptation of an Irish novel by A.M. Shine. So the story follows Minna, who is an American expatriate working in a pet shop in Galway. On her way to Dublin, where she must deliver a rare bird, she breaks down in the middle of the forest and meets an older woman, Madeline, who urges her to take refuge in a bunker where 2 other characters are hiding, Chiara and Daniel. Every night, the four refugees must stand in front of one of the walls of the bunker, equipped with a one-way mirror that allows creatures called watchers to study them as they please. Little is known about these observers, except that they originated from holes in the ground around the bunker in the forest, and that they hunt anyone who ventures out of it during the night. So these films, despite being very different in terms of budget, release, international exposure, systematically associate wetlands and the liminal spaces they contain, so tunnels, holes, sinking sounds, with a mysterious, threatening Gaelic past populated by creatures from Irish folklore. So we have changelings, shape-shifting fairies, or more explicitly, inhuman monsters, demonic monsters. As such, these films can be labeled folk horror, a subgenre of British horror which emerged in the late 1960s. Folk horror cinema mostly relies on a distinctively bleak and secluded setting. The disturbing atmosphere that the characters evolve in often has, I quote, adverse effects on their social and moral identity. Adam Scoville, who is the author of this first quotation, goes on by identifying the anxieties of modern societies about rural environments, writing that folk horror is about, I quote, the evil under the soil, the terror in the backwoods of a forgotten lane, and the ghosts that haunt stones and patches of dark, lonely water. Folk horror is particularly pregnant in Irish cinema, probably because of Ireland's complex sense of place and cultural identity. More generally, folk horror borrows from the genre identified by Michael Dylan Foster and Jeffrey Talbot, the folkloresque. As they explain, simply put, the folkloresque is popular culture's own emic perception and performance of folklore. So emic means from inside the group. That is, it refers to creative, often commercial products or texts that give the impression to the consumer that they derive directly from existing folkloric traditions. So in the films under study, boglands are not only a constituent element of the Irish landscape, serving a descriptive function, but they're also integrated into the diegetic space or used for symbolic purposes. The hole in the ground is a place of danger for the young Christopher, who is forbidden by his mother to go into the forest. The tunnel allows the passage of the changeling in the hole in the ground and the watchers in the film of the same name. We also have toxic fumes escaping from a gaping hole beyond the woods, or the source of a fungal infection that turns humans into hybrids in the Hallow, which is associated by the introductory scene with the hole left by an uprooted tree. It is also the murky soil from which Alice's hand emerges and grabs her mother's heel to pull her down with her in Wakewood. So this is the end, towards the end of Wakewood, and resurrected Alice is actually pulling her mother down through this kind of sinking sound slash sucking hole that we have at the end. Finally, it is also the murky waters from, sorry, that was before, yeah, and the muddy waters of the pound where the mother in You Are Not My Mother almost drowns her daughter in the pond nearby. So this dynamic of a natural element threatening a human characters is a kind of reversal of the balance of power that has been in place since the British imperialist era, namely the human capacity to control and objectify natural space. Natural space which is becoming, and I'm quoting Simon Estock here, smaller, mappable, predictable, and less diversified. As such, the bog becomes constituted in the Gothic as a space of crisis, which conceptually creates a point of contact with the ecological. And this is one of the many definitions we have for eco-Gothic, this one provided by William Hughes and Andrew Smith. Interestingly, wetlands and tunnels or holes in these films are systematically located in the middle of forests, woods, or natural parks. While symbolically this is a kind of coherent choice, both places are dark and eerie, associated with wilderness, bestiality, and obscurity. This analogy is rather paradoxical from a historical perspective. Actually, most bogs in Ireland are the result of human action, that is to say, colonial deforestation as early as the Protestant plantations in the 17th century. So basically, forests were erased to create more arable land, and these fields, most of them were abandoned during the Great Famine when farmers died, and they became boglands. In a way, the bog is the negative, the spectral trace of the forest, both haunting and haunted, which makes them perfect locales for Irish folk horror cinema. So I'm going to start with the spatial dimension of the Irish bog in these films, starting with a very quick introduction to boglands in Ireland. First of all, the term bog comes from the Old Irish bog, which means soft. Boglands represent 1/6 of the country's total surface area. But boglands are not specific to Ireland. You also have marshes in a lot of European countries, in France, in England. You have a lot of peat bogs in Scotland and Denmark as well. From a geological point of view, Irish peat, so the matter you extract from the bog, is composed of several layers, like a palimpsest. So we have light peat, sediments, some layers which are said to be anaerobic. That means they do not require oxygen, which allows the conservation of many objects, but also bodies in remarkable states of preservation. So this is one of the most famous of them, the Tollen Man, that was found in Denmark, but we also have a lot of these bodies in Ireland. So this Tollen Man dates back to the Bronze Age, and the photographs of this body fascinated Irish poet Seamus Heaney, and he wrote a lot of remarkable poems about him. So these layers inside the peat can also contain mineral, vegetal, and animal elements that slow down or, on the contrary, enhance the decomposition of bodies. Hence the cultural fascination around peat bogs. So we have a lot of stories about ghost spirits, spectral lights such as will-o'-the-wisps, sprites, and so on and so forth. And we also have an economic dimension to it. A lot of Irish people depended heavily upon peat extraction because they use it as fuel. And this is still the case of some people today. So this is an essential element in the Irish landscape, its history and its economy. And it kind of testifies to Ireland's complex relationship with the notion of space, as Derek Gladwin notices. Bogs exists in the Irish Gothic imagination as contested and peripheral spaces, while representing significant cultural codes, nevertheless have been treated as zones of waste, horror, and fear that are rife for exploitation. Luke Gibbons also insists on the weight of an atavistic past that continues to haunt the present, that of an oppressed and alienated community. As he says, the bog stands for those aspects of the Irish past which will not go away, so it's very Gothic. So the history of Irish peatlands illustrates their ambivalent status. They are at the crossroads of both ecological and human time, when the former is disturbed by the latter. Frederick Allen's term humanized landscapes underlies a form of ontological instability. While some marshes, as I said, are natural, a lot of them are the product of human action, massive deforestation. And this is what he says about that. While in part natural, the initiation of blanket bog at some sites is attributable to the human removal of the forest cover for farming. So bogs can be seen as ecotones. So the word ecotone means ecological transition zone. That is to say, an in-between space. There's another concept that can be used to study these in-between spaces, which is the concept of the heterotopia, coined by French intellectual Michel Foucault in his famous text, Different Spaces in English, Des espaces autres in French. So to him, heterotopias are, I quote, outside of all places, both utterly real and utterly unreal. Heterotopias reflect, transcend, and question the social and cultural emplacements of a specific human milieu. As a heterotopia, the bog, tunnel, hole is untraceable. The characters of the watchers or beyond the woods get lost as soon as they enter the forest where the tunnels are located because they are unable to use their phones. Louise and Patrick in Wakewood stumble upon this bogland by accident while wandering in the forest. And so do Sarah and her son Christopher in The Hole in the Ground. So entry into the forest that harbors the bog is systematically ritualized. It's kind of a threshold that needs to be crossed. Here you have a representation of that threshold as a gate or this kind of change of scenery between forest and pond. So once they have penetrated these sacred or unholy grounds, the characters are different, either cursed by forbidden pagan knowledge or harassed by the evil incarnation of their loved ones. It is therefore a space of change, deviation, crisis. I'm going back to Foucault here, for people, individuals whose behavior is deviant from the average or the required norm that exist outside of normal rules. So this notion of passage is crucial in the interpretation of the bogland, which becomes a liminal space. In the film You Are Not My Mother, we have at some point a voiceover of a documentary that the main character is watching that says, I quote, "In folklore, rivers, bogs, lakes, and caves are often seen as places where fairy folk could enter the human world or lead humans to theirs." So these spaces are between our world and the other world. And Shar unwillingly finds herself in a liminal space, an in-between place, as the voiceover tells her. While the perfectly symmetrical shot of her watching this documentary illustrates her central position in the film and in the tunnel of the exhibition. So the tunnel is, of course, a kind of visual analogy to what I was telling you about this kind of underground place. Liminality, as you may know, is first an anthropological concept that was developed by Arnold van Gennep and Victor Turner. Turner expanded van Gennep's concept of rites of passage, moving from one social status to another, by saying that liminality was a kind of interstructural situation characterized by instability, in which the passenger, he also called him neophyte, retains an ambiguous position as they are no longer part of a social structure and not yet reintegrated into a stable one. So one of the best examples would be puberty, which is in between childhood and adulthood. According to Turner, while in the transition phase he calls limen, hence the adjective liminal, the neophyte remains structurally, if not physically, invisible. This invisibility is also associated to death and spectrality. He says, I quote, "A neophyte is structurally dead." It fits within a Gothic narrative of social annihilation and subjectal dissolution. Marcus Opolzer argues that while liminality represents a transitional voluntary stage in successful rites of passage, it threatens to become a permanent and involuntary state in Gothic narratives. So like Foucault's symmetry, the heterotopia par excellence, according to Foucault, the bog maintains a link with death and the anxieties of the non-decaying body. Each film stages the invasion of intimate space by the deviant, the hybrid, whether it is the traditional monster who transgresses the boundaries of home in Beyond the Woods, in The Watchers, or the parent, so it's either the son, the daughter, the husband, or the mother, who themselves become a dangerous chimera emerging from a distant place, the underground, and a distant time period, Gaelic Ireland. So we have this notion of time that is also essential in the understanding of the Irish bog, which I'm going to tackle now. So the bog transgresses, as I said, both spatial and temporal rules, becoming a heterochrony as it is linked to Ireland's Gaelic past. Halfway between the eternitarian heterotopia, heterotopie éternitaire, that of, I quote, "a time that no longer passes," that the symmetry, and on the other hand, chronic heterotopia, that which is based on the mode of celebration, like this theatre stage. The Irish woods and their tunnels bring to life the spectres of pagan superstition, the myth of the changeling, which intersects with the fable of the child taken by fairies. in out of 6 of these films. The presence in general of an underground world communicating with reality through tunnels or water places is a common characteristic of these films, but it is something you can also find in many folk horror productions, Irish or British or whatever. Shyamalan's film is certainly the most explicit in its appropriation of an Irish tale, that of the myth of the Tuatha Dé Danann, a fairy people condemned to find refuge underground after their defeat against the Milesians. So very quickly, this is a historical fact. Around the year 2000 before Christ, the first peoples, Gaelic peoples from Eastern Europe arrived to Ireland. Here they either exterminated or assimilated the Neolithic peoples that were already there. And this battle gave birth to this myth of the Tuatha Dé Danann, who kind of went underground after their defeat and became either fairies or gods and goddesses. So the film uses this myth, portraying the creatures, the Watchers, as a humanoid race determined to reclaim their their place among us through dissimulation. So by observing the humans locked in the bunker, they perfect their mimetic ability until they blend into the mass and find their place outside of the tunnels. The film kind of makes fun of the traditional commodification of Gaelic folklore as it uses it as a mirror to modern anxieties. Here, in this particular film, we have the fear of AI's generative capacity that overlaps with a broader eco-Gothic discourse. So here is a quotation from the character of the doctor who experimented on the Watchers and realized that they were able to mimic human beings. And as you will notice, these hints at making size mistakes in sizes and number of fingers is very typical of the mistakes that AI used to make before. So we have this particular modern anxiety that encroaches upon a broader discourse that is eco-Gothic. So this idea of the menacing return of vengeful nature. So I have a quotation here that explains it better than me, exposing the socio-ecological crisis produced by the capitalist organization of nature. This is what eco-Gothic is about. And we have also, so eco-Gothic has its roots in the genre of eco-horror that is also here to denounce human imprint on the environment and also to raise mass consciousness about the very real threats that will face humanity if we do not change our behavior. So these threats, I'm borrowing this definition from Joseph Foy. These threats are here in these films easily identified. So we have mining and resource extraction in Beyond the Woods, genetic experimentations in The Hallow, farming in Wakewood, urbanization in The Hole in the Ground, and AI and cloning in The Watchers. You're Not My Mother provides a less environmental-centered plot, but covers nonetheless issues involving human control over natural conditions, such as medication, bipolar disorder, the faith in medicine versus superstition. At the crossroads between folk and eco-horror, the film's understudy suggests that Ireland's Gaelic identity and pre-colonial state have bred pagan monsters that are coming back with their revenge, at times embodied in external monsters or turning characters into monsters themselves, which is exactly the dual pattern which Jarlath Killing identifies in his study of the Irish Gothic. So Killing focuses on Irish Gothic literature, but this idea of having, on the one hand, fantasy of the not I, involving relations between self and other, and on the other hand, fantasy of the I, which is about expelling the other hidden within the self. This is exactly what we have in these films. So these monsters, exhumed from the ground by too much digging, can be read as eco-somatic markers. I'm borrowing this concept from Chai-Hoon Lin in her study Eco-Gothic and Monster Science. These markers are, in other words, the physical manifestations of an ecological trauma, of an environmental imbalance caused by the uncontrolled flows of resources and organisms advocated by capitalism. This disorder appears on the screen as a wound that scars the natural green space of the forest or the environment in general. So we have on the one hand grayish, brownish holes and tunnels, and on the other hand this kind of lush green natural spaces. In Wakewood in particular, as you can see, it feels like the natural environment is somehow constrained and wounded by barbed wire, by this rusty farming tool that is almost blood red. So all of these elements appear as injuries inflicted by humans, and I'm quoting Rosie Braiderty here, she's coming, recorded in living systems over the long term and incrementally. Rob Nixon talks about slow violence, the violence inflicted by us onto the environment. So this notion of trauma comes from Freudian and Lacanian studies. Trauma is understood as the physiological response to a primitive shock. So Freud coined the term Nachtraglichkeit in his studies in hysteria. Basically, an individual's initial trauma is obfuscated by layers of memory until the initial trauma and memory is forgotten or repressed. Jacques Lacan proposed a few decades later to revise this theory with the study of the après-coup, afterwardsness. In the accounts of these two theories, trauma is strongly linked to the notion of time and the impact of an action from the past on the present. In the hole in the ground, the huge crater, which visual analogy, so we have here at the top, you have this aerial shot of the crater, and the second image, the still that I have chosen, is a close-up on foam and water going down the drain while Sarah is having a shower. And in this shower scene, she realizes that her forehead wound has reopened and has blood. So in this scene, we understand that Sarah has been the victim of domestic abuse and that she's been running away from her former abusive partner. So this visual analogy kind of shows that the crater can be understood as a ghostly trace and a gaping wound left by the traumatic event initially repressed. So while the notion of trauma is mostly limited to a victim's individual response, recent studies of trauma in specific contexts of war, terrorism, genocide, or natural disasters claim a broader understanding of the notion in a collective setting. More specifically, the concept of ecological trauma or eco-trauma has recently attracted interest in academia and studies of popular culture, film, literature, but also psychoanalysis. So each of these films that I'm studying today feature protagonists grappling with a change of scenery, most of the time triggered by a traumatic event, and facing the consequences of humankind's taming and destroying of the living world. More specifically to Ireland, in an article published in 2009, Tim Wenzel lamented the loss of primary forests in Ireland, which he attributed to the colonization of Irish lands and its transformation, Irish land, and its transformation into agricultural land. In the same year, he offered an in-depth analysis of this process by identifying what he called the urban sprawl, this kind of new threat of global capitalism, the underbelly of the Celtic tiger. So this notion of urban sprawl is very Gothic. It suggests contamination, colonization, and it appears as a counterpoint to the eco-Gothic bogland. This chromatic opposition between grey and green I was mentioning reflects post-colonial understandings of the imperialist and capitalist destruction of the natural world. In Wakewood, we have a lot of farming going on, a lot of farming tools that are used to provoke, willingly or not, violence and death. I'll go back to this in a minute. We also have the limits of the village, which resurrected Alice must not cross if she wants to stay alive for these 3 days. These limits are marked by a line of wind turbines that you can see here on the screen. These turbines eventually provide shelter to the distraught mother who lures her daughter to her death once she has understood her deadly nature. So this scene features the rumbling sound of the turbines, which adds an eerie dimension to the moment when we see Alice bleeding to death as her fatal wounds, the ones caused by the dog, reappear. So she has gone too far. So she has her wounds reappear and eventually they kill her a second time. In a way, the little girl embodies the victims of untamed bestiality and humankind's illusory control over organic matter and the living through unresolved trauma and grief. We also have something similar in The Hollow, which opens and closes with a reflection on deforestation. So in the introductory scene, we have the voice of a journalist on the radio that says that Ireland is the only country in Western Europe that has no forest belonging to the public. And this threat of deforestation is also illustrated in the ending credits, as you can see here in these with these stills. So we have first a shot that shows basically the deforestation process, and then we have a pan to the left that really marks the division between, on the left, the dark and eerie forest, on the right, this kind of place that is seemingly controlled by humans. And despite the fact that we have a white van, a white truck passing in the foreground that kind of denies this opacity of the forest, actually the truck stops and we have a close-up on the logs that it is carrying, as you can see on the screen. And a zoom in on one of these logs shows a blackish and viscous substance, the mark of the fungus infection that is spreading. We also have in the last shot, because it is folk horror, we have a screamer, the head of one of these creatures I was mentioning, screaming at us, as if to call out to us that on these wounds that continue to ooze. So if the hole in the ground is the open wound of Irish eco-trauma, then the endangerment of family, friend circles, and society in these 6 films appears to be the ultimate after effect, a threat to the very ability of Irish society to survive and reproduce. Speaking of which, my last point is going to be about female characters. You've probably noticed that all of these films actually feature female characters that kind of interact with these boglands. So it's the tunnel where Sarah crawls to find her real son, the marsh where the mother in The Hollow has a car crash and later finds her baby. It's also the pond where Char's mother takes her. In the scene, as you can see, a wide angle shot locates the mother in the middle of the pond as if she owned the place. The bog and its avatars, therefore, are a nodal point around which relations of power, oppression, and even erasure of the female body are articulated, and which, I'm quoting Smith and Hughes again, reinvigorate debates about the class, gender, and national identities that inhere within representations of the landscape. So to discuss such relations of power, the films I have selected use a staple of the Gothic, the doppelganger, or double motive. Chia Hung Lin analyzes Stevenson's Mr. Hyde as embodying Dr. Jekyll's repressed animal energies. Hyde's body represents what the industrial spirit has been trying to channel since the Victorian era, the bestial, the natural, the wild. In each of these films, a female character undergoes a process of self-discovery that implies reuniting with her other self, what Emily Ash would phrase as reclaiming our libidinal relation to nature. Facing that other self often implies in cinema confronting one's reflection in the mirror. So this is a staple of both horror films and more traditional cinema, this kind of introspective moment, the looking at one's face in the mirror scene, very much used. It is used in every single film I have selected. For female characters mostly in all of these films but one. In The Hollow, it's the father looking at himself while he is transforming into this hybrid creature. The Watchers and Beyond the Woods actually make particularly good use of this motive in order to illustrate the ethical and moral dilemmas of certain characters. Mina, who struggles to find closure after her mother's death, is revealed to have an estranged twin sister. The ending of The Watchers even hints at the possibility that she could be a descendant of a shape-shifting fairy. The mid-shot of her being perfectly reflected in the one-way mirror conjures up images of chimeras and Siamese twins. Lucy, in Beyond the Woods, who believes herself to be morally superior but actually fails to help her friend and sacrifices him for her own sake at the end, moves faster than her reflection. You can see this in these two pictures I've taken. And later, Emma, who cheats on her partner and seduces her hostess's husband during the film, um, notices, that her reflections, movements, and her own movements are not synchronized. So you can't see it well, I think, but her reflection is staring at her while she is moving, and the two movements do not match, and the reflection conventionally is smirking a little bit. As though her evil double in the mirror was the one responsible for her actions. Unable to embrace her desires, she is eventually killed by the demonic creature. Sorry. The mirrors here hide an otherness that the female characters, must embrace in order to find their own identity. The surface of the mirror becomes this hybrid membrane that serves as a mediator of interactions between the constituents of one's sense of self. So the whole thing, all of our desires, all of our thoughts, and so on and so forth. So while these films question the cultural representations of femininity in general, they are also interested in motherhood. In particular, this will be my last point. So Corin Hardy's father ventures into the forest at the end, beyond the marsh, to rescue his son from the cordyceps infected creatures. However, he doesn't have to fight them. They accept to give up on the baby. And one of them, a sort of mother figure, even gives the father the boy's dummy back. So this picture shows the hand of the creature with the dummy on it. So monstrosity and motherhood are not incompatible, it seems. And while the real mother escapes from the pack of creatures, she is shown at the very end coming back to their former house, now fully infested with fungi. In the same way, Madeline, once revealed as being a watcher herself, spares Mina and is shown watching over her in the guise of a little girl at the end. This ultimate shot combines the eeriness of this kind of hybrid face with echoes of Madeline's motherly attitude towards Mina throughout the film. The mother's quest for truth in the hole in the ground also necessitates going down underground twice, get rid of the usurper and rescue her legitimate son. Sarah's geological descent is evocative of that into the darkness of our own insanity and paranoia. At the end of the tunnel, so we have real Sarah at the top left-hand corner and the other Sarah she encounters at the end. So we don't really know who comes out of the tunnel. So this second Sarah is an ideal version of femininity that either embraces the paranoia, changelings are real actually, or takes her place as ideal mother. Therefore, the bog can embody the very threat of mental collapse, domestic violence, but also societal entombment, a modernized incarnation of the civil death of 19th century Gothic fiction heroines. In Cronin's film, vulnerable women and mothers are literally buried, as Sarah and Noreen have their heads put underground by supernatural forces, as you can see in this picture. Such scenes extend the absorbing qualities of the bog to the earth and the soil and the ground in general. Just like Louise and Alice are absorbed by the ground at the end of Wakewood, and illustrate the Gothicization of domesticity as the two women are half buried in their own gardens. In You're Not My Mother, Shar is told that a changeling must be burned to change back what she was herself, and that she was herself swapped after her birth, burned by her own mother, and therefore saved. Now, the ones that took her in the first place want to come back for her. Charles' mother's weird behavior is staged as the result of her being replaced by a changeling, a member of the fairy folk. Her true nature is revealed in her distorted reflection in the mirror that you can see. It's not great. You should see that her face is slightly distorted. Right before the revelation, that is, she is indeed not Charles' mother. Angela is seen dancing in a wild way. By the way, and in traditional Christian representation of fairies in Ireland, these fairies were understood to be fallen angels. So we have a kind of connection with the name Angela here. So she is seen dancing in a wild way, pounding her fists against herself, against the floor. This abject bestiality, loss of control over her body. She even breaks her right ankle, continues dancing somehow. She screeches, she crawls on all fours. This suggests her return to a pre-civilized state, before centuries of Christian doctrine that dictated women's understanding of their bodies, their physiology and rights. Objection, according to Kristeva, is what disturbs identity, system, and order. Angela's instability, her unapologetic reclaiming of her body, is abject in the way it disturbs traditional representations of women and mothers as controlled and subdued. Finally, Wakewood stages two visions of motherhood. Louise, Alice's mother, embodies the rational and educated woman. She's a pharmacist, neatly combed hair, always clad in white. A medium shot in the street that you can see here, playing with mirrors and reflections, opposes her to Daedra's mother on the left, whose appearance suggests superstition and paganism. So you can't see her well, but we can see her in the film. She has long, unruly hair, long skirts. She's using trinkets to cure her daughter, so she's full of cliches. And yet, once tempted by the idea of getting Alice back, albeit for 3 days only, Louise indulges in the abject pagan ritual. She and her husband follow the mayor's rules and desecrate Alice's tomb to cut off one of her fingers. The sequence, which I have decided not to show you, alternates close-ups on Patrick struggling to cut through the bones and Louise's disgust and horror, the whole scene's repulsive aspect being reinforced by diegetic noise. Then they have to use the corpse of another deceased, put the relic in its mouth after it has been maimed, its thorax crushed, spinal cord cut, jaw broken, all of it using farming tools. So this is very interesting, kind of ties up to what I was saying about natural environment being wounded by farming, by intensive farming. Alice's second birth is also abject in the uncanny blurring of boundaries, so between the human, the animal, and the mineral. When the fact that she comes out as a girl, not as an infant. This scene also echoes one at the very beginning. We see Patrick giving birth to a calf by C-section. So we have this kind of mixing between the animal, the mineral, and the human. So to conclude, by identifying their female protagonists with the main natural landscape of their films, bogland, dirt, ground, hole, tunnel, the filmmakers inscribe their works in an ecofeminist background and suggest a structural similarity between men's domination over women and their attempts to control nature. If Beyond the Woods ends on a rather pessimistic note, all of the characters are eventually punished for being very selfish. The final girl being run over by a car after betraying her friend for her own sake. The other 5 films suggest another way out for their main character, female characters, one that necessitates, I quote Caroline Merchant, the return to animality and earthly slime. That is to say, the return to objection. So the bog and its avatars conjuring up images of verticality, layers upon layers, perfect illustration of the Gothic motive of unnerving. What is exhumed in the end is our colonial and patriarchal responsibility, but also an underlying threat of revenge, the victim's grudge. At the crossroads between the eco-Gothic, the underbelly of the Anthropocene, and ecofeminism, these films remain for some ambivalent in their treatment of femininity and motherhood, unfortunately, probably due to an overwhelming Christian and Gaelic, to a certain extent, legacy. Sarah, for instance, is cast as the virginal and desexualized mother who eventually reunites with the parthenogenetic mother when she enters the tunnel. and comes out holding her unconscious son in her arms. Barbara Creed contends that the monstrous child is usually analyzed as representing their mother's illegitimate desire. By rejecting her changeling son, Sarah denies such identification and recasts Christopher as the object of sexless maternal protection and perfection. The medium shot of the chimeric creature formed by Sarah and Chris walking away from their burning house, this is at the end of the film, suggests a desire for non-differentiation between mother and son, and reinscribes Croning's narrative into one of perfect, primeval motherhood, one validated in traditional Catholic and Gaelic narratives of sacrificial mother figures. And that's it. Thank you very much.